UNSW Canberra at ADFA, and it's a real privilege to chat with you here this evening. In 1918, Australian-led air power dispatched an Ottoman army during the Battle of Armageddon in Palestine. 100 years later, Australian air power was again operating in the Middle East during Operation Okra. A century seems a long time in the contemporary world, but these 2 points in time, Armageddon and Okra, are inextricably linked in terms of the Australian experience of war. And tonight I'd like to chat briefly on why. Of course, as they are in a good Air Force brief, there's always a bit of a scope there. But first of all, I'd like to touch on that image for you. And it's a splendid image of the Australian Corps Memorial in a little village at Hamel in France. Of course, on the 4th of July, 1918, General Monash and the Australian Corps defeated a German army at Hamel, and it was the first time Australian troops had fought alongside their American counterparts in operations. Of course, at that time, we were also a dominion in the British Empire. So this picture, more than anything for me, is a picture of the way things were, and then a picture very much of the way things were going to be 100 years ago. Australia as a dominion, and then Australia leaning forward with its US counterparts. And of course, we've got 40 minutes or so to chat this evening, so I've got a proposition and I've got a few notes on the screen to talk about what the book tries to capture. That leads me directly to a proposition, of course, and as a military aviator, what's written on the screen for me is self-evident, but it's well worth exploration. I believe it's essential to appreciate the way that Australia's air power has always been acquired and applied. And as an aside, the aircraft on your screen are iconic. Sopwith, Hawker, the Royal Aircraft Factory, de Havilland, and of course that Bristol fighter on the lower right side of your screen there, that was effectively the Super Hornet of its day. What I might say as an Air Force officer is that I have an intrinsic sense of serving in an institution that is almost as old as Federated Australia. So what this means for me, and I believe that it's an inherently human trait, is that understanding who we are is also elemental to our belonging to this fine service. Knowing our service is only a start to this, and it's up to an institution like us in the Air Force to reinforce an understanding of its journey. And I think that the Air Force does this very well. Just briefly on air power and effective air power. Effective air power is entirely about the use of technology in a judicious way. And you can see those images on your screen, upwards of 100 years old. Air power technology over that 100 years has developed exponentially. And just to contrast that, you can see on the lower right side of your screen, 50 years ago, we were operating helicopters and jet aircraft over South Vietnam in 1970, 1968. But 50 years before that, we were also operating Bristol fighters over Palestine in the Middle East. Now, of course, we look at those Vietnam era aviators in the same way that they looked at the aviators in the First World War. And that is a very significant understanding, because we can only imagine what air platforms and air power are going to look like 50 years hence in 2070. So I suppose to understand this, we have to understand the way that Australia has always gone to war, and that has always been under the auspices of a great and powerful friend, the British Empire, and of course these days our ties to the United States. So just push this point forward. I'm going to take you on a slight journey to illustrate the point before we have a look at Armageddon itself. That's a fascinating map of course, it's the British Empire 100 years ago. It says so much in a way that's positive and negative to modern eyes, doesn't it? What's positive in this particular map is that we have an economic and territorial network linked and enabled to function by rapid advances among steamships, railways, postal and communication services, and by British banking, business, and a governmental or Westminster organisation. So if we look at the red on this map on which the sun never set 100 years ago, this was the British world, and Australia was very much part of it. Of course, a picture paints 1,000 words for us here as well. This is what we gave to that British world. Sugar, beef, mutton, wool, wheat, gold, etc., etc. So the wealth of Australia's industry and our rural and pastoral industries all went back into the empire. But of course, what we received in return was all of the technical and economic benefits of belonging to the superpower of its day. I said earlier, those companies, Sopwith, Okra, the Royal Aircraft Factory, Bristol, access to them was our return for being in that empire. I also see Harland and Wolff on the screen. That was a company that built the Titanic. Perhaps there was a slip when I put that picture up on the screen as well. Anyway, our context is almost complete. In these points up on the screen, I'd like to convey to you the essential notion of Australian air power. Buying British technology in support of Australia and the Empire in 1918 was every bit as important as the way in which the contemporary nation invests in air power. I'd like to chat about that fellow on the right too, Sir Richard Williams, founding father of the RAAF. He was a tireless champion for Australian air power in the 1920s. And for those of you in the know, his autobiography was called These Are Facts, and that's hence my play on words here. More so, Williams was instrumental in the defeat of Ottoman Turkey during the Great War, and that's not a supposition. As Dickie Williams would have said, it was a fact. It's a fact that Australia's ties to a powerful ally resulted in the first decisive and independent defeat of land forces from the skies. And that leads me straight into Armageddon, or our first bookend. I've got to touch on the Great War, of course. Australia was automatically involved when Britain went to war in 1914. We were a dominion within the empire. In the Middle East, aside from Gallipoli, which is most well known, Australia contributed aviators and flying squadrons in a British pattern, and they did so well that by the last year of the war, 1918, an Australian, Dickie Williams, was commanding number 40 wing of the Palestine Air Brigade. This was a first-rate organisation, and what you see on the screen in front of you was a product of that British world that we were a part of. Armageddon, of course, that refers to the Battle of Megiddo in Palestine during the First World War. Palestine, modern Israel, in the charts on the side, in which Australian-led air power was instrumental in the destruction of a Turkish army on the 21st of September 1918. Armageddon, of course, is mentioned once in the book of Revelations as the site of the predicted apocalyptic battle of the end of days. The location was an important strategic township in ancient Palestine, north of Nablus, the modern city of Nablus, and southeast of Haifa. The ruins of this fort that you can see, a Roman fort on Megiddo, were used as late as the 3rd century to guard the important trade route from Egypt to Syria, and they dominate views of the plains of Sharon towards the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and the valley of Jezreel, both famous biblical names, to the south as well. These ruins are still there. As an aside, of course, I'm told that Megiddo is a particularly central Queensland pronunciation. In the Semitic tongue, the name Armageddon comes literally from the Har-Megiddo, or the hill on Megiddo. This is the Armageddon of biblical fame, of course. So stepping forward then to Armageddon in 1918, we see a British army under Sir Edmund Allenby launching an offensive from the Sinai against the Ottomans to drive them from Palestine and then push them back into to Syria. During the opening hours of the operation, British forces, and of course these were Empire forces from the United Kingdom, from Australia, from New Zealand, even West Indian troops were involved in this operation. They drove northwards along the coastline and they turned east towards the ancient ruins of Megiddo, as you can see on the screen. Turkish forces were entrenched, they weren't flexible, and they unravelled and fled before this force that was attacking them. The roads across the desert were choked as they retreated, and they made easy targets for British and Australian airmen that ranged ahead of the army. In particular, from Nablus, that lower arrow on the screen, the Turks attempted to flee eastwards towards Jordan, across the Wadi Farah and the River Jordan, where that dotted line is on your screen. That image on the right side is in fact the Wadi Farah, and there is a narrow and precipitous path along the left side that the Turks were trying to negotiate as they ran away. There's some air imagery taken by one squadron in 1918, and of course all that does is highlight the nature of the terrain and what that would have been like, choked as with people and equipment and animals as they fled towards the east. 21st of September, that was a significant day in 1918, as it was again 96 years later. Flying at dawn on this day, 2 Bristol fighters from one squadron, AFC, reported thousands of Turks retreating along this narrow road through the Wadi Farah. What they did was bomb the lead vehicles and horse carts, and then they set to work on a trap column behind it. One of the aviators saw his bullets hit panicked men as they clambered up the cliff sides, and both aircraft continued to rake the length of the column. Once all the ammunition was expended, they then waited for replacement Bristol fighters to arrive, and they returned to their base to rearm. What's interesting about radios in these particular aircraft is the transmitter sets and receivers were so heavy that the aircraft could only fit transmitters, and they could send a message to the base to tell replacement aircraft to join them. They would wait, and then they would return to base to rearm and refuel. Throughout that day, I found some fairly graphic descriptions of what went on, but one in particular from Leslie Sutherland, who was an observer in one of the arriving aircraft, said that for 2 days, up until the 21st of September, it had been butchery. But he could think of no word to convey the dreadfulness of the action on the 21st of September 1918. And in fact, the official history actually recorded what went on, as you can see up on your screen. Sutherland's aircraft in particular bombed the rear of the column, and that effectively trapped it. And for the rest of the day, all of number 40 wing bombed and machine gunned the trapped men and horses in reloads. Only one machine was brought down and its crew survived. The nature of the terrain allowed little movement off the road, and the result was as chilling as it was decisive. So for those of you who could imagine this, I'm thinking of horses, wagons, men, high explosive against rock face. All of these images you see on the screen were taken in the aftermath. And when British ground forces arrived a day later, it was estimated that there were about 5,000 Turkish dead. Williams was even advised that his crew should not go to view their work because the scene was so disturbing. So there we have it. The events in the Wadi Farah precipitated a Turkish collapse. Damascus in Syria fell on the 1st of October. Aleppo, the last city to fall in the campaign, surrendered on the 26th of October. And over that 5 weeks, the British offensive had advanced hundreds of miles, perhaps thousands, and they had captured over 75,000 Turkish prisoners. 5 days after Aleppo fell, the Ottomans sued for peace and an armistice was struck aboard the British warship HMS Agamemnon on 30th of October 1918. Now, this is poetic. The Agamemnon, namesake, of course, of the Macedonian king, or the Greeks, the Spartans, who went to Troy or Anatolian Turkey to defeat the Trojans. I can't imagine for an instant that the Admiralty didn't select this particular vessel for its name to accept Turkey's surrender for any other reason than that. So there we have it. The war ended in 1918 with the British occupying the territory that was to become the Mandate of Iraq, Palestine, the Transjordan. The French, of course, due to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, looked at Syria and Lebanon. The Ottoman Empire was totally destroyed, and of course Russia was paralysed by a civil war to the north. So Britain became the dominant power in the region. Of course, all of this is the makings of the modern Middle East, and that's one bookend of what we're going to chat about this evening. I can step forward now 100 years because we no longer live in a British world, as it were, but Australia now enjoys the protective deterrence afforded by its alliance with the United States. And of course, in that, interoperability is the key. That's why I put that up on the screen. Our interoperability, particularly in terms of air power, allows Australia to deter potential threats because we're enabled in our acquisition and application of these high-end capabilities. Of course, otherwise, without that alliance, all of this capability would be beyond Australia's economic reach. Equally, that interoperability also means that we've got shared security interests with our major defence allies and our partners as well. Briefly then, our alliance. And in our alliance, I note with a few sidebars that the predilection for the Australian procurement process has always gone from buy British, then to buy American. And you can see probably the one exception on the screen is the sidebar with the Mirage that was in service for over 25 years with us as well. Irrespective of that, today, Australia sources its most important combat capability from the United States, including fighter and transport aircraft, our systems, and everything to do with that. Our white paper indicates that around 60% of our acquisition spending is in fact on technology from the US. So here we are this decade. We've chatted about Armageddon, but Okra, Operation Okra, was the name of the modern operation in which the Australian government committed air power, not only on the same date, 21st of September 2014 was when the Air Task Group left, as opposed to 21st September 1918, but it was initially the same squadron, one squadron, flying in the same part of the world, conducting very similar tasks as well. Who was the adversary? Here's a bit of a sidebar. The Islamic State, known as ISIS, ISIL, Daesh is a colloquialism for them. They emerged from the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2004. That fellow on the screen was running rampant when I was a youngster over in Iraq 15 years ago. It faded into obscurity for several years after the US surge in 2007, but ISIS, of course, began to re-emerge in 2011, commensurate with the drawdown. Over the next few years, it took advantage of growing instability in both Iraq and Syria to carry out attacks and bolster its ranks. The group changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, in 2013. We'll step forward a year to 2014 when things started to get very ugly over there. ISIL spread northwest from Baghdad along the Euphrates River Valley. This is the cradle of civilization in which mankind first planted wheat 10,000 years ago. It captured Mosul in the north, and what I understand is that its path was littered along the way with rape, murder, looting, and of course the wanton destruction of priceless archaeological sites throughout the region as well. Any opposition to this fundamentalist ideology was met with violence. Public beheadings were routine, and captured Westerners were filmed as they were brutally executed. Its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared it a caliphate, that is a religious kingdom that stretched from Aleppo in Syria to Diyala, just west of Baghdad in Iraq in 2014. Coalition, Air Force led by the US commenced airstrikes in August 2014 to bolster Iraqi security forces, and they expanded their campaign during September and October 2014. On the 15th of October 2014, the United States named the campaign against ISIL Operation Inherent Resolve. And of course, Okra was Australia's contribution to that campaign. We had a UN mandate, of course. The United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2170 on the 15th of August 2014, and that condemned gross, widespread abuse of human rights by extremist groups in both Iraq and Syria. And Australia was one of many legitimate nations that voted with the UN resolution to condemn ISIL's actions and indeed foreign fighters fighting with ISIL overseas. And we joined with a coalition of Western and Middle Eastern countries to target and defeat Daesh. You can see on this screen that took several different aspects. Our contributions came in terms of building partner capacity, so training both Iraqi conventional and special forces in Iraq itself, but of course we're chatting about the RAAF Air Task Group that Air Vice-Marshal Roberton first commanded in 2014. That group was designated Air Task Group 630, and Prime Minister Tony Abbott made the decision to deploy. The problem for the West, having just fought a protracted counterinsurgency in Iraq, was this notion of providing assistance to a sovereign nation without deploying a large number of troops back into the region. But the solution was straightforward. The West built Iraqi forces capacity, while US coalition-led air power supported Iraqi troops in the field. The Air Force, of course, was foreshadowed by a potential government decision to deploy combat assets as late as August And by the end of the month, several senior officers from the Air Force had visited the Middle East to discuss with international leaders the roles and basing arrangements for Operation Okra. Tony Abbott then mentioned in the middle of September that Australia would deploy RAAF strike assets at Iraq's request, of course, in a small, though inherently vital combat commitment against Daesh. ATG 630 came into being. This announcement was immediately followed by the televised ISIL beheading of a Western aid worker, Englishman David Haynes, and Tony Abbott's response was quite explicit. It's a death cult, uniquely evil in that it does not simply do evil, but it exalts in evil, he stated, and Australia would intervene using military force. Air power is significant in this sense because it provides a precise but crushing instrument against an adversary, and it enables a nation like Iraq to exploit those few characteristics I've put up on the screen to create a favourable outcome for the forces that it's supporting as well. Of course, AVM Roberton has spoken about that distance that you can see on the chart there. That presented practical challenges because of the short timeline, 15 September, and I'm led to believe that by 28 September, the Air Force needed to be commencing operations. More so, its success depended on the conduct of all of the core and enabling air power roles working in conjunction. So 96 years after the Wadi Farah to the day, 6 Super Hornets from 1 squadron and 2 KC-30 tankers from 33 Squadron departed Amberley for Pierce, and the next day a Wedgetail AW&C aircraft joined them from Williamtown. The following day, the ATG departed for Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and they continued on to the UAE, where they arrived on the 24th of September. They indeed conducted their familiarisation sorties on the 28th of September, and the first of hundreds, thousands of combat missions were then conducted on the night of the 8th of October 2014. So this superb effort is worthy of note. From a standing start, the ADF flew an air combat group and its support personnel to an international base and commenced preparations and then conducted operations over 12,000 kilometres from home in only 2 weeks. Splendid, I must say. I'll chat briefly about the aircraft. First of all, the KC-30A Airbus derivative multi-role tanker transport from 33 Squadron. This aeroplane's a heavily modified Airbus A330 airliner. It's designed to conduct air-to-air refuelling and to provide strategic airlift. It features advanced communication and navigation systems and an electronic warfare self-protection system to protect it against threats from surface-to-air missiles as well. It's the largest aircraft in the modern Air Force, and it can carry a combination of up to 270 passengers, 8 military pallets, and 110 tonnes of fuel. So a very versatile aircraft. The Boeing E-7A Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft, and AWACS is operated by number 2 Squadron, RAAF. And of course, this aeroplane is also based on a Boeing design, the 737-700 airframe, commercial airliner, but of course that's heavily modified to include a multi-role electronically scanned array radar. You can see on the dorsal surface there, and 10 state-of-the-art mission crew consoles, which can track airborne and maritime targets simultaneously. This is a highly advanced AWACS. I'm led to believe it's currently the best of its type in the world, and it provides a coalition, in addition to the RAAF, an air battle management function, which enables a gathering of digitised data from a suite of sophisticated sensors there. The data is correlated and then distributed to friendly assets in the battle space and to participating C2 nodes beyond the battle space as well. These splendid images are the sharp end, if you will, of the air task group. The aircraft on the top is originally the McDonnell Douglas F-18A Hornet, which is a multi-role fighter attack aircraft that first entered Air Force service in 1985. It's referred to these days colloquially as the classic Hornet, and it's capable of prosecuting air, maritime and land targets with precision munitions through integrated systems, including radar, active warhead systems, heat-seeking missiles, and an infrared pod for targeting and sensing purposes. And I believe if it hasn't been completely retired, this aircraft is shortly to be so. The aircraft on the bottom, the F-18F Super Hornet, is a later derivation of the Hornet. It's larger and more capable than the earlier model. The original Hornet manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas, was merged into Boeing in 1997. These two types look very similar, but the Super Hornet has a crew of two, a weapon systems operator in the back. It's a metre longer, and it's got a wing area that's over 25% larger than the classic Hornet. What that does is effectively increase the type's fuel capacity and its payload. The power plants, I believe, are also capable of generating about 30% greater thrust than the classic Hornet there as well. So there we have the Super and classic Hornet in their guise over the Middle East. AVM Roberton spoke about these distances, and I just want to touch on this again for us. I'd like to look at the essence of the combined effect that these three platforms I've just described bring to a coalition. And I've put the characteristics of air power up on the screen for good reason. In that earlier slide, I mentioned a few of them. What I can add to the characteristics is the sheer distances involved in operations across the Bible lands from Egypt to Syria, but more so during Operation Okra, which is what that chart depicts for you on the screen. This is a major consideration for operating and maintaining aircraft in this part of the world. I might paint a picture for you. During our commitment to Okra, we based our platforms at facilities in the UAE that you can see on the southeastern corner of the map there. And the distance from there in these facilities to Iraq's southernmost city, Basra, is nearly 600 miles in a straight line. The distance then from Basra to Iraq's northernmost city, Mosul, is about another 450 miles. So to get from the UAE all the way up to Mosul in the north of the map means flying northwest along the length of the Gulf, with onwards clearances being provided by air traffic control. It's not that simple though. Have a look at the route and the liaison required. Clearances from Qatar, Bahrain, the Saudis, Kuwait, and then into Iraq. And of course, there's the sensitive Iranian airspace that abuts the flight path over to the east as well. Crews also have to consider an appreciation of where they may need to divert their aircraft along the way should they encounter any technical or other difficulties as well. So that's looking at that part of the world, but the analogy for us is the same as launching from Brisbane, flying to Melbourne to conduct operations for several hours, and then turning around and flying back safely to recover in Brisbane. That process, of course, is inherently complicated, and Australia did it very well. The environment needs a few words as well. Many of us have served over there during the summer, and the short explanation is that the Middle East is punishing. The climate is extreme in terms of the heat and aridity, and this is extreme even by Australian standards. A few years ago, I've read a thermometer in Basra in summer, and it tipped 50 degrees centigrade and 85% humidity. And Basra is on the coast, so it's bound to be humid there as well. I've heard from air and ground crews on Okra that a flight line in summer in the UAE can top 70 degrees Celsius as well. And I can only imagine what it's like working on aircraft or preparing them for flight during the heat of the day. In fact, I can't imagine it. I heard stories from some of the techs operating over there that some of the crews had to be physically lifted from the cockpits at the end of a sortie because they were so exhausted from focusing for such a period of time and in that heat as well. There was a shift system worked out for the duration of Okra so that most platforms could be maintained in the cool of the overnight or early morning temperatures, but that's relative cool for us. The temperature at dawn in the UAE in summer is still about 35 degrees. One thing I saw at Al Dhafra Air Base that fascinated me was this notion of an ice vest that was worn by technicians operating on the flight line during the day. The ground crews would store a vest literally made of cooler packs in a freezer, and they would then wear them when they're outside working in these extremes. Accommodation and messing facilities afforded some relief because they were air conditioned, and later on there were air conditioned servicing facilities as well. But I must say, I greatly admire the personnel who operated in Palestine during the Great War. Back then there was no air conditioning, there were no modern facilities, and the standards were very rudimentary compared to what they are today. I've got to highlight that this sort of environment is just as punishing on machinery too. Temperatures bake equipment that's left outside in the sunlight. Imagine wiring, it simply breaks down, and pliable materials such as rubber simply melt or decompose. And I haven't mentioned the dust. The extreme temperatures in the Middle East, updrafts precipitate heated air, and large dust storms called the Khamsin in Arabic result during the middle of the year. And these cross Palestine, Jordan, and then into Iraq as well. So maintaining aircraft in such conditions is a very difficult endeavour because dust gets into everything. Operations. By the time then Air Commodore Roberton's ATG 630 commenced comedic operations in early October, circumstances were grave for the Iraqi government. We were there at their behest and their request. ISIL controlled the nation's north as far south as Tikrit towards Baghdad, and west to the district and town surrounding Mount Sinjar on the Syrian border. And that's Mount Sinjar taken from a wedge-tail aircraft on the bottom of your screen. It crossed the border and besieged Kurdish controlled areas and then west into Syria before turning left and south and tracking down along the Euphrates River Valley to the towns that were made famous in a decade before for the fighting around them, Fallujah and Ramadi as well. So aircraft operating against ISIL, having transited with civil clearance into Iraq, would then switch to a military control frequency and agency. And for the strike element, this would require them to sit on station and await direction to contact a controller on the ground. The controller was generally a coalition specialist, a special forces specialist, in fact, attached to the Iraqi army, and that soldier would direct the pilot and crew to train their platform sensors into a contested area in order to reduce a detected ISIL threat. For the wedge-tail and the tanker crews, they would establish a position at a predetermined point in order to best service what was occurring in the combat on the ground below them. ISIL had captured large numbers of anti-aircraft artillery of about half-inch to 1-inch caliber. Although coalition air tactics generally ensured that strike aircraft would stay outside the envelope of these weapons, there was still a danger there. It would only take one round or even a piece of one round to force a fragile aircraft down. And what that meant, upwards of 1,000 miles from home, was almost certain death for the aviators involved. Just to highlight how terrible that death would have been, in January 2015, some of you may recall a Jordanian fighter pilot downed in northern Iraq, captured, put into a cage, and then filmed while he was barbarically doused in petrol and burned alive. Of course, air power still pressed on, and initially ISIL seemed unable to reconcile the fact that coalition air power had such accurate data at its disposal about their whereabouts. They did learn the hard way, and I got some stark recollections from some colleagues and some people that I in fact worked with years ago, and their recollections of what occurred in the battle space. I'll just give you one. For example, one airman, a friend of mine, he recalls Daesh attempting to disguise themselves by their movement in a taxi cab in the north of Iraq. They were tracked by his aircraft and positively identified before being engaged with a laser-guided munition. This chap said to me it was really strange. Despite that taxi being destroyed legally and all its occupants killed, the taxi sign on top of the roof was undamaged, and it was still lit. And that chap recalls that story to this day. There's 2 points to that story, then, of course. I might briefly then chat about these 2 points and how the notion of accuracy is captured in the phrases precision and targeting. The notion of precision, here's a definition for you. That encompasses the quality, condition, or fact of being exact and accurate. During coalition air operations over Iraq and Syria, air-launched precision-guided munitions, PGMs, denied ISIL the cover of weather, shelter, and darkness. Our rules of engagement were prescriptive, and the enhanced accuracy of PGMs, along with discrimination and proportional targeting in that fight against ISIL, ensured that weapons were delivered with almost surgical accuracy there, of course. The other half of that equation, of course, is targeting. In fact, I've got a couple of specialists in the audience who will correct me if I get this wrong. Dave Glorine, I can see you there. Of course, in that, the data required in the targeting process for sensitive targets is often perishable or time sensitive, And that means an adversary or centre of gravity is not always where a precision-guided munition is aimed or programmed to strike. The adversary may have moved, the surrounding environment may preclude an airstrike, and the fluidity of the battle space is such that the fight has moved on. And I want you to have a think about the permutations in that fog of war in combat operations, and the immediacy of making those sorts of decisions in that sort of battle space as well. Now, of course, our strike elements remained there for 3 years. When they first arrived in that 1st December 2014, ISIL held sway across Iraq and eastern Syria. It dominated 8 million people. 3 years later, in December 2017, it didn't hold any territory and it subjugated nobody. There's an estimation that at one point in early 2015, there may have been as many as 50,000 armed fighters, armed Daesh. 3 years later, any fighters that were left in Iraq, I believe, were either in prison or killed. I'm not making any claims here that air power did this. In fact, Australian Air Power was invited to assist, and what it did was assist in facilitating any Iraqi claims to victory. During this period, this 3 years that I've described briefly, only very briefly this evening, Coalition Air Power worked ahead of Iraq's ground forces, and they worked to attract ISIL's capabilities. I'm nearly at the end, folks. These matters I've just described on this slide, they're statistics. Victory over ISIL can't be measured by statistics. We're talking about people, and only the Iraqi people and soon the Syrians can move positively into the void left in the aftermath of these tragic years, and it's still going on. The restoration of the ruins around Mosul in the north, the rejuvenation following the destruction along the Euphrates River Valley, and all of the shattered landscape, all of this now provides an almost overwhelming task ahead for Iraq's government. There's a question, and that is, how does Iraq tackle the problems of reconstruction, governance, and counterinsurgency across this sectarian divide? And that's where the political dimension and the human assistance comes in, because I suppose my final point that I draw out of this presentation is that in ABM Roberton's initial push, air power was a means to an end, but it was not an end unto itself on that operation. And ladies and gents, thank you so much for the privilege of being able to both pen this story, but also to chat with you this evening. I'll take any questions that you have, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we go to questions, I'd like to just everyone give a round of applause or virtual applause for Lewis for a fantastic presentation that really backs up his book. It's fantastic work, Lewis. So before I then pass out to the audience for questions, if anyone has a question, I ask you to go onto the chat and just list your name. Don't have to put the question there, and then I can set up the order for the questions. But for those of you who are in the Air Force or have been in the Air Force, as a good ITO, an introductory and thanking officer, I'll lead off with the first Dorothy Dixon question for Lewis. Lewis, so a question for you. You've told us all about the book and the content of the book. Let me ask you a challenging one. Other than Darryl Fell and myself, what was the most challenging part you had in putting the book together? Noting that Darryl and I were the ones trying to keep you honest.
And you are up, sir. I might say you did a splendid job, as did Fabi, in keeping me honest. And Martin James and Air Commodore Lax, of course, I greatly appreciated their input. The immediate challenge for me, Armageddon was straightforward. We're talking 100 years ago, ladies and gents. The nature of that operation has been recorded in official histories. I might even say ad infinitum in Australia's commemoration of Anzac over those years. Operation Okra was very different. I knew of no unclassified document or resource that enabled me to put a picture together of what I understood had gone on throughout Iraq. Of course, I'd served in Iraq during the surge in 2007. I had travelled as far north as Mosul in my capacity there, and also down to Basra. So I had an appreciation of what the region was like. But 10 years later, I was fascinated to find that I was not able to put together a campaign narrative at an unclassed level of what had occurred. So, like all good researchers, I suppose, and I bumbled my way through at the beginning, I did a spreadsheet up, and I started at the US drawdown, and then I looked at what had occurred through the media, open source media, over the subsequent 6 or 7 years, so I could build a timeline of what had occurred during Daesh's rampage. And of course, we're not talking air power here. Context is everything. I was fascinated by the ruins in Palmyra, in eastern Syria, priceless archaeological artifacts destroyed by fundamentalists, how Daesh and ISIL were able to fund themselves by establishing some sort of a regime that took over local infrastructures, and putting a picture together at an unclassed level there as well. Now, of course, DG H&H opened the books to me, and he enabled me to chat with AVM Roberton. And of course, I was very fortunate that I had both trained and worked with many of the ABM crews on operations, and in fact, quite a few of the fast jet aviators as well. So I had that presence still that resonated with a few of them. I also went to view with the War Memorial the operations that were occurring firsthand, and that enabled me to paint a picture in my head. So the difficult part is, short story now, sir, is to paint a picture using prose that will resonate for a reader. And it took that kind of effort behind it. I hope that answers your question.
Great. That's fantastic.
Yep.
All right, so the first question I have from Mr. Adam Lunny, another author. Adam.
Thank you, Fredo. Thank you, sir, for your presentation, and thank you again to Fredo for allowing the general public to be present at an event such as this. My question is about the combat search and rescue potential for downed aviators, or potential downed aviators. Since Iraq was essentially a friendly country, was there any potential for something like an Osprey to be forward deployed into zones where the jets were operating to be a potential rescue package, or was it just a matter of cross your fingers and hope for the best?
Well, look, of course, there were precautions in place, as I understand it. Crews did not simply go to an AO and operate with their fingers crossed. They had packs specific to their particular type of sortie that they were flying. Of course, battle space management capability was able to track all platforms in the AO. I'm led to believe that there may have been combat search and rescue platforms available. I cannot say whether they were offshore or, in fact, at a base in Iraq at all. Perhaps are you there, ADM Roberton? Are you able to speak to that at all, sir?
Yeah, Fredo, thanks. It is a good question. There was a couple of American-run facilities, both in Baghdad and then further north. And of course, as you correctly pointed out in your synopsis, when we first got over there in September, October, much of it was out of control. And indeed, the Iraqi government genuinely feared for the overrun of Baghdad. But as the fight progressed more successfully to the north and almost in a counterclockwise sweep, combat search and rescue elements, mainly American controlled, were able to be put forward. And we had some of our own special forces folks helping. Thank you, sir. Thanks. Adam, I hope that answers your question. And there you have it from the commander's mouth.
Excellent, thank you. I guess the special forces element we won't find out about for a long time to come.
All right, well, thank you, Adam. The next question's from Air Commodore Meier.
So, hello.
Hey, Lewis, good presentation, mate. Great book. I am biased. Look, Lewis, you mentioned briefly the guys on the ground controlling the close air support and the strikes. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on the role of 4th Squadron, RAAF, and their function in the fight, given that the RAAF, we've spent a lot of money on that particular squadron, as the former air commander well knows, and in some ways, without the Air Force boots on the ground, we would have problems controlling and applying our air power.
Yeah, thank you, sir. That's a very good question too. Of course, I alluded to controllers on the ground who would designate targets for coalition strike platforms. Australia's contribution to that, of course, we had special forces trainers that were allocated to training Iraqi SF in and around the Baghdad International Airport. That element also had attached to it an RAAF combat controller. In fact, a combat controller undergoes selection. An Air Force officer or troop, both male and female, I believe these days, undergoes special forces selection, and then they go through a range of reinforcement training that both teaches them the fundamentals of air power operations, but then steps them through a targeting process and designation process that enables an interface between ground forces and strike assets that are operating in support of ground forces there as well. So 4th Squadron, a classic Army cooperation squadron that operated in New Guinea, I believe, during the Second World War, was reformed upwards of a decade ago to add this combat controller capability to the RAAF, and it has done so extremely well, I might say. 4th Squadron combat controllers, that's only one part of the squadron, are allocated and seconded to Australian Special Forces units to provide this interface and this service of designating targets in support of both ground troops and their own operations. Laser designation, for example, of a target, and collaboration and cooperation with aircraft operating in the battle space above them as well. Talking with Wedgetail, talking with the jet aircrew to bring weapons onto targets in the most accurate possible way. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. Appreciate that. They get a little bit unsung sometimes.
Yes.
All right, Lewis, the next question I've got is from Michael Veach. So he sent the question, so I'll read it out. Firstly, he says, wonderful presentation, so well done. So from Squadron Leader Michael Veach, that's high praise. I'm wondering if Australia's AFC efforts in September 1918 were recognised by higher powers as being a part of the overall victory.
Michael, thank you very much, and I'm pleased to meet you, even though it's virtually, of course. Let me look at a micro level. They were certainly recognised by Dickie Williams immediately. They were recognised in Dickie Williams' appointment as the OC, a Dominion OC, and we tend to forget about that sort of thing today, of a Royal Air Force wing. So those efforts in the Middle East and Allenby's appreciation of what air power brought to a planning table in a fight was inherently understood by senior officers from Williams upwards. And of course, Williams was a tireless advocate for air power in Australia, and it was his work and effort that brought about the formation of the RAAF only 2 or 3 years later. The other thing that strikes me is that the concept of air policing immediately after the war in this part of the world, in which air power, I'm talking about a operational cul-de-sac too, but the influence of air power in the Middle East was such that proponents such as Winston Churchill and the Air Ministry thought that air power could save on costs of deploying large numbers of troops to maintain oversight of this Palestine mandate and this Iraq mandate in the 1920s. And what we see to a large degree is that in many cases it worked, but of course the technology of the time was not enough so that air power could maintain a precise and accurate oversight and offensive capability in that sort of environment. So air power was recognised by early theorists as being or as giving a promise, but it took a subsequent number of decades before that promise started to be realised. Michael, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, sir. It does. Really great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And the last question we've got lined up here is from Despina. I think she might be another author out there. Her question is, in regards to your approach in writing the book, how did you balance the writing, or would you balance the writing for a general audience versus for a RAAF audience?
Well, look, I was, that's a splendid question, Despina. I have this notion that today the RAAF personnel are a reflection, I like to think, of wider society. Air Commodore Meier and yourself, sir, Dave, gave me a brief, and that was research it, make it educational, make it interesting, make it readable, make it unclass, of course, which cut the book in half and ensure that it underwrites Air Force's place in Australian society and the ADF. So that was straightforward. From there, of course, one researches, one organises, and I suppose, as I did with my PhD a few years ago, you just simply write. There's a phrase that English teachers, I'm an English teacher as well, use, and that is write, W, until you get it right, R-I-G-H-T. You write, you rewrite again. And Group Captain Fredericks will attest to this. This was the source of most of our bickering, because I would write and write and write, and then he would read it and give it back to me, and on we went with this sort of thing. Revise your work, balance your work, get another set of eyes to look over the top of it. Air Commodore lacks and Martin James were very good colleagues in their appraisal of what was going on there as well. And Darryl Fell, again, in particular, looked at imagery that made the work interesting. So the short answer, Despina, is I wrote it as I saw it in accordance with the brief that I was given. And of course, we can change the intricacies of the brief in terms of classification or technical capability, and then we change the intent of the particular document as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lewis. I really look forward to reading the book.
Lewis, I'd probably add in there the challenge, again, I think writers get very close to their work and they can't see the forest for the tree sometimes. And I think, it's that having worked to edit your book and to try to find that middle ground. And I know we had numerous discussions about, and very, I won't say heated, but strong discussions about the use of the word notwithstanding all the time.
Yes.
And, just trying to make it so it's readable. And that's the challenge, that you have all the knowledge in your head, but to try to then shape it so it becomes something that a person can pick up and from start to finish just read through.
Yeah.
And I think the advantage of that particular book style, and hats off to the Air Commodore for us adopting that, is looking at how we've used the drawings or illustrations for Anita Franzi, the breakout boxes, and the large amount of pictorial, because that helps people understand what it was like, which is very hard to convey in words. So well done to that.
Thanks, sir.
The next question we've got, and I'll say the final question because we're coming up to 8:30, is from Adam Lunny. And Adam, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for taking a second question. Just in relation to the anti-air threat that our people faced,
Yes.
based on the weapons they carry, the weapon systems, how often did they actually get within the potential range of enemy systems, if you can answer that question?
Look, and of course, Adam, thanks for the question. I can answer in a very general sense there as well. What I know is that ISIL captured large numbers of munitions from opposing Iraqi forces. They then turned those particular small AAA caliber systems back onto coalition air power where they could. You can envisage that there are ranges and capabilities associated with AAA, and that's quite easy enough to look up in James. Of course, where there is intelligence indicating that there is AAA in an environment, there are particular envelopes that aircraft will then fly in order to counter the weapons that are being ranged against them. Of course, there are any number of sensors and other suites of systems that give these sorts of warnings for more complicated systems that are ranged against coalition aircraft as well. And with appropriate queuing, they can be avoided as well. So does that give you a high-level answer, Adam?
Yes, I was expecting something along those lines that wasn't too tactical in the detail. So yes, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
I think that's probably the last question then. So I'd just like to wrap up then, Lewis, to say on behalf of the whole audience tonight, thank you very much for your time. And again, thank you very much for the blood, sweat and tears you put into writing the book. You should feel proud not only to have the book out there on the streets, but also proud that you are the first in this series, that we have a lot of eminent authors who are going to be putting books and adding to this. So you are, to use the Air Force term, the pathfinder for us. So well done. Air Commodore Meier, do you wish to add anything further, sir, or are you happy?
Yeah, just a quick one. Lewis, look, besides the book itself is a magnificent effort. I really appreciate you being tolerant of being the crash test dummy for us to get our act sorted out so we can continue to produce these. The lessons we've learned from you has made the second, third and subsequent volumes a lot easier to get through the system. So thanks very much. I appreciate it. Cheers.
So thank you, and Group Captain Fredericks, Martin as well. The the collaboration I received to put all of this together, it's just been splendid. An absolute privilege. And I am more grateful for the opportunity to share this story than I can clearly articulate here this evening. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And before we wrap up now, I'd just like to say that tomorrow morning, for those of you who are interested at 10 o'clock, we're doing our normally monthly Zoom webinar, which is Kristen Alexander. She'll be presenting on the Australian Airmen in Stalag Luft 3 and the challenges of trying to win the war from inside. So yes, for those of you who can make that session tomorrow, it'd be really great to see you there. And for those who don't, wish you a Merry Christmas and a quiet period and a break, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you very much. So
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much, sir. All the best. See you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night. I'll stay on, sir, for a moment if you like.
Yep. Okay, mate.
Adam, I'm so sorry.